Spider-Man and No Way Home. I'm gonna be honest, this is probably one of the only MCU projects after Endgame that has actually got me interested enough to watch it. There were a couple others like WandaVision, but I hear that goes to shit by the final episode. Maybe Hawkeye, but yeah, I'll see it when I get to it. This one, though, got me interested because it went in a completely different direction than what I was expecting. See, the original pitch for this, as I understand it, was that this was going to be a Kraven the Hunter film, where Kraven would presumably be the one trying to hunt down Peter Parker / Spider-Man, and Peter would have to deal with the whole idea of his secret identity being out. I didn't see Far From Home. I only know the plot details from No Way Home and from internet discourse and stuff. But I thought the idea of Spider-Man being outed and having to figure out how he's going to live his life while also being Spider-Man could make for a potentially cool movie in its own right. But then they announced the multiverse idea and that they were going to be bringing back Dafoe as Green Goblin and Alfred Molina and even some people from the Amazing Spider-Man films. And then Doctor Strange was going to be in it, and it looked like they were going to be taking some cues from One More Day of all things. Really crazy shit. It could just be obnoxious fan service, but it could also be a movie that actually manages to juggle all these disparate elements together. So for this short little non-spoiler section, I would say that No Way Home is actually a pretty good flick. It's not amazing. I'm not a diehard Spider Bro, so all of these little Easter eggs and stuff, they didn't hit as hard for me because I'm not super invested in the Spider-Man character in general. Just getting a Spider-Man movie is not enough to make me foam at the mouth. I'm not a Spider Bro. You have to give me something else to care while I'm watching this guy, especially when he's already had so many fucking movies by this point. And this film largely succeeds. In fact, the thing that I'm most impressed by is that a lot of the fan service, not all of it, but a lot, actually is treated as story relevant. Green Goblin has an actual dynamic with this Spider-Man. He's not just there so everyone who's 20-something years old like me can foam at the mouth and go, "Oh my god, Green Goblin is here!" No, he's actually a really cool antagonist in this, and I would even go so far as to say the Green Goblin in this might just even be better than in the very first Raimi film. Alfred Molina still kills it as Dr. Octavius. Jamie Foxx gets another shot at an Electro, and boy, seeing him in this version really makes the ASM2 one look even worse than it already was. Because Jamie Foxx could have been a legitimately really cool Electro, not just a bad guy, but a cool character in his own right, and he could have garnered a lot of sympathy from the audience as he ends up doing here. But that's the non-spoiler section. Overall, I would say that if you can get to this movie and it's not gonna cost you an arm and a leg like it costs over here in fucking Croatia, then it is well worth a watch, particularly if you're someone super invested in Spider-Man. Alright, now on to the spoilers section. Okay, first I'm gonna be a bit negative because I think it's a fair criticism to have. The whole idea of Spider-Man's identity being outed is not really dealt with that much. It's more dealt with how Peter feels about the whole situations versus the legal technicalities of it. Because Mysterio framed Peter for his murder, and he also kind of frames Stark Industries for playing a part in that, the first 10 or 15 minutes are devoted to just the immediate aftermath of Far From Home, and this is where a lot of the stuff that could have been a movie in its own right, and it could have been a really good movie in my opinion, is just kind of condensed and not really swept under the rug, but it has to be swept to the side at least for the rest of the movie to happen, and for it not to last 5 or 6 fucking hours. Peter doesn't really go to court. He doesn't really face any kind of on-screen litigation problems. Him and his friends get interrogated by the police at one point. We get that cameo from Daredevil, of course, played by Charlie Cox from the Netflix series, which is pretty cool, I guess. But what I meant by the aftermath of Peter's identity being revealed being more emotionally important than it is on a practical level is that Peter, Ned, and MJ are finishing high school, and they're starting to send I guess their grades and their personal information to colleges across the country to see if they're going to make it into MIT. And because Peter Parker has become this lightning rod of the media, of a media shitstorm, he and Aunt May have to basically relocate to a Stark-owned private condo with this special security, so he and his aunt don't get mobbed by reporters all the damn time. he doesn't get into college, basically. He doesn't get into college, and he and MJ and Ned also don't get to do it. And so Peter feels really shitty about this because this thing happened that was kind of out of his control, and now his friends and even his remaining family are eating shit because of it. And that's kind of like the biggest consequence emotionally of Peter getting outed as Spider-Man. It's the whole idea of, what does this emotionally do to a person? What does this do to them? How do they view the world? How does the world view them? And what kind of guilt does stem from that? It's a cool angle, and it's probably the only way you could keep the identity being revealed relevant, ongoing throughout a story that is largely about multiverse shenanigans. And I think that is done decently well enough, but still, as someone who would have liked to see a Spider-Man who just operates with his identity out there for at least one movie, I can't help but feel that there was a missed opportunity here. That it could have been really cool to see Peter maybe go in front of like the college board and convince them that, yeah, just because I'm Spider-Man and just because I'm in the middle of this fucking shitstorm doesn't mean that my friends need to pay for it. And they kind of do that, admittedly, but the movie gets hung up with the aforementioned multiversal stuff, so it's just kind of there. That's my issue with it. But on the flip side, once the movie gets into the multiverse stuff, it does go into some interesting directions, and this is where I was most pleasantly surprised by the film. See, the whole gimmick with the villains is that the villains are being brought over from the other universes at a point before they die or get killed by Spider-Man. And so a chunk of the movie is spent Peter just encountering these villains, collecting them, bringing them to Doctor Strange's dungeon so he can send them all back in time. But when Peter sees that all these people are broken, they're broken people, they're damaged, they have power, but they don't really have a sense of responsibility, or the power has gone to their heads and it's warped them, or it's made their existing character flaws worse, or it's even twisted good intentions that they have. And as Peter starts to empathize with all the antagonists to varying degrees, he realizes that just sending them back in time to die would be really wrong. And this is a great angle because it's treating the villains as these damaged, broken people, sort of like what you'd see in some Spider-Man stories, but it reminds me a lot of good Batman stories. Batman stories that remember that guys like Scarecrow are fucked in the head. They're not just evil supervillains because reasons, but their physical changes also come with mental ones, and they deserve help. And Peter wants to help them. He wants to help cure them of these things that are screwing with their heads so that when they come back to their native universes, they don't have to die fighting Spider-Man. They get a second chance, which is also what Peter wants for himself. But the problem with that is that if Peter starts to openly do Spider-Man stuff again, his one flimsy shot at possibly getting his friends into college is going to be ruined. And so there's this kind of conflict of responsibility, power, kind of avoiding responsibility, trying to maybe sweep some things under the rug that makes all the multiversal interactions really great. And it also helps that a lot of the villains are just, like I said before, performed expertly. Defoe, Molina, Jamie Foxx are the three big guns. They do an excellent job. They show great depth and humanity. When Green Goblin appears, he is so fucking terrifying, and I'm so glad that Green Goblin is treated as like the ultimate antagonist, which he should be. Green Goblin is Spider-Man's arch nemesis. If Green Goblin appears in a movie, he should be a big deal. He should be making big, dramatic things happen, and he absolutely does. Like when he gives the whole speech of, we're not broken people. There's nothing wrong with us. We are gods. We have the power. We can shape the world to be whatever we want it to be. And the fact that Green Goblin takes this perverse interest in Peter the same way he took in Spider-Man 1 is really interesting, because in Spider-Man 1 there was this kind of whole dynamic of Norman wanted Peter's acknowledgement because Peter acknowledged Norman's virtues as a scientist without any kind of ulterior motive. positives. In No Way Home, they twisted really cleverly where Norman sees how constrained MCU Peter is by his circumstances, how the chains of morality are holding him back, how he's just suffocating and just barely keeping his head above the water. And when Green Goblin sees this, he also sees an opportunity. He sees someone who is begging to break out, who's begging to just do whatever the fuck he wants and screw the consequences. And Green Goblin purposefully targets him for that. It's great. Despite the fact that he comes from a completely different universe, and this Peter Parker has no connection with the Osborns, he doesn't know Harry Osborn, and in fact, it's implied that the Osborns don't even exist. The fact that they're able to create this really personal, twisted connection, not just between Norman and Peter, but also Green Goblin and Peter, and the way that's used for good drama is really damn effective, and I was really impressed by that. Goblin is played 100% straight. Whenever he shows up, the tone of the movie completely changes. There's no more jokes. There's no cutaway yags. Whenever Goblin is around, people die, and it gets nasty, and I loved it. That being said, not all the villain stuff is that great. Fox, Molina, and Defoe are the strongest ones, whereas Lizard and Sandman feel like they're there just to be there. Lizard is the most flat character of them all. He's taken from before he's defeated in ASM 1, so his motivation is just, I want to turn everyone into a lizard. Not much is really done with him, which I think is a shame because maybe they could have, reintroduced the idea that in the ASM universe he has a family, and maybe he's doing some of this for them, or maybe kind of draw some sympathy for him. He's mostly just a CG thing to beat up in the movie, and I believe his actor doesn't even appear properly in the movie. They just reuse footage of him from ASM. Sandman's kind of the most confusing because Sandman never dies against Spider-Man. He's not an antagonistic force against Spider-Man. He just wants to get back home, but then in the final battle, he's fighting alongside Electro, who wants to destroy his only way of getting back home. So I don't know. It feels like Lizard and Sandman are just there so that people can say that they're there and to get kind of a bit more excitement out of the audience. But back to the positives, the Spider-Man. The Spider-Man actually handled really well. They're not just glorified cameos as I expected that they would be, but no, they actually show up a good hour before the movie even concludes, and the movie spends a lot of time trying to establish, connections between these various versions of Peter, and what they do with them is really interesting. Tobey's Peter is easily the most well-adjusted. He's portrayed as the oldest, the most experienced. He's the one who has presumably gotten together with Mary Jane, which serves as a nice contrast to the younger Spider-Man. At this point in the film, MCU Peter has lost Aunt May, so he's really he's on the knife's edge. He's feeling really, really shitty. Meanwhile, Andrew Garfield kind of serves a similar role in this film that Spider-Gwen did in the Spider-Verse movie, where he has more or less given up being Peter Parker. His return to Spider-Man in ASM 2 is reframed more as him just kind of losing himself in the mask. He doesn't really have any friends left. He's a loner, even more so than ever before, and it's implied that he started to get more and more violent the more he's abandoned the Peter Parker side of his life. And this movie, just like with Spider-Gwen, is him reforging new connections with people, realizing that, hey, just because I'm Spider-Man and a lot of shitty things tend to happen to me, that doesn't mean that things can't work out. I've literally met two other versions of myself who have gone through just as bad things as me, and they're going to be alright too, so maybe I can be alright as well. And he really impressed me, I think, the most out of all three of the Spider-Man, though Tom Holland also gets a lot of great material to work with. He shows off a lot of rage when it comes to the Green Goblin stuff. A lot of fear, a lot of just, I want to fucking break this guy's neck, and Holland does it convincingly. It's probably the most dramatic material he's gotten to work with in the MCU, and I feel like he pulled it off very well. But I've always been kind of like the biggest fan, I guess, of Andrew Garfield. I don't know, somehow he just carries himself the most what I imagine Spider-Man to be. He's got the voice, he's got the mannerisms, he's kind of the best at the smartass act. So I've heard rumors that he wants to do more stuff with his version of Spider-Man. I would be fine with that. It would be cool for him to get at least a proper conclusion for his corner of the Spider-Man multiverse, for lack of a better word. The last point I want to talk about is the ending. The ending is something I'm very mixed on. On the one hand, Peter choosing to get the spell properly done so that everyone forgets who Spider-Man is a good. It is him accepting responsibility for the fact that everything has gone to shit beforehand. He has to do it or the fabric of reality is going to break apart. That's all good. My issue with the ending is how much of a weird, hard reset it is for this Spider-Man, because now Peter Parker has virtually never existed. Happy doesn't even apparently know that Peter was May's nephew, even though he and May still dated in this continuity. None of the stuff between MJ and Ned and Peter happens as well, which makes a lot of the previous events a big question mark, to say the least. And it also just kind of feels shitty that after everything this Spider-Man goes through, he's basically left with no family, no friends, in a shitty-ass little apartment with no money, and he's about to go off to college, and yeah, it just feels like falling back on the tired Spider-Man trope of Spider-Man must eat massive amounts of shit in his life or he's not Spider-Man. I personally disagree. I feel like the movie could have just had Peter meet up with Ned and MJ, not have them know who he is at first, and then maybe they reveal that they do know him or that they do remember him, so Peter still has some connections to other people left. Because as it is, the ending feels kind of generically mean-spirited to him, and I think that's a mistake. And it also just kind of reeks of Marvel wanting to distance Spider-Man away from the other Marvel material, so that if a breakdown with Sony happens again, as it did a couple years ago, Marvel can safely delete him out of the MCU entirely without needing to worry about, oh well, where's Iron Man, where's Doctor Strange, and where's Thor? So yeah, it is kind of a shame that the movie does not quite stick the landing, but the good stuff is still the good stuff, and I would still recommend that you guys go see this one.